Thank you. Um, and thank you to the East-West Center and the Korea Press Foundation for hosting, for me here in Washington, D.C., tonight's seminar on trilateral cooperation challenges and prospects. I'm obligated to note that my comments today are my own and should not be attributed to the Department of Defense. And what I'd like to talk about is in particular one challenge that faces the trilateral relationship among the US, Japan, and Korea. Before I do that, as Pak Chul-hee noted, we have seen an incredible turn in relations between Japan and Korea in the past year. A lot of this can be attributed undoubtedly to President Yoon and his efforts to really turn around the relationship. He deserves a lot of credit for that. The White House has basically used the term political courage and political leadership to describe what President Yoon has done. But without taking any credit away from President Yoon, the external environment also compelled an improvement in Japan-Korea relations. The war in Europe, China's increasing assertiveness, North Korea's unstoppable missile testing, all of these things created an environment in which countries like Japan and Korea were all experiencing security deficits like they haven't experienced in the past. And I think that also had something to do with the improvement in relations. What's interesting about the current improvement in relations is that while the United States has supported it, they have not really played a very active role in intervening between and encouraging the two allies to come together as historically they have done. This has really been a product of South Korea and Japan themselves. The forced labor compensation deal was really a product of South Korea and Japan themselves working this out more than a lot of US support. But I do want to talk about one common challenge for the trilateral relationship. It's not about North Korea, although North Korea clearly is a challenge. And it's not about Taiwan, a Taiwan contingency, although that is often what is talked about here in Washington, D.C. these days. I think that there is, by the year 2027, despite a lot of the talk in Washington, D.C., I think there is probably less than 10% chance that China will take military action against Taiwan. However, I think there is a 100% chance that China will take some sort of economic coercion action against Japan or South Korea or any other countries in the international system. And so that's where I want to focus some of my remarks tonight. And they're especially appropriate given that this was a major focus of the G7 summit. And I'd like to also, in doing this, offer my own ideas about how to counter Chinese economic coercion. So it's no surprise to anyone, I think, that China's economic coercion has become part and parcel of its foreign policy against many trading partners. Countries that interact with Taiwan, support democracy in Hong Kong, oppose genocide in Xinjiang, or offend any other core interests of China face discriminatory, non-WTO conforming sanctions and embargoes. Targets of this weaponization of trade since 2008 number over 18 countries, including Japan and South Korea, and over 123 companies, precipitating billions of dollars in economic damage. From China's perspective, economic coercion works after sanctioning Lotte, for example, in 2016 over the THAAD battery and embargoing imports of German pork in 2020. Both countries remained silent when China passed the national security law in Hong Kong suppressing democracy. Brazil did not exclude Huawei from its 5G auction for fear of losing billions of dollars in business. In 2018, to preempt sanctions, the Gap clothing company issued a public apology that removed from sale a T-shirt designed with the map of China that did not include Taiwan and Tibet. Japanese fashion clothing manufacturer Uniqlo remained silent on human rights violations in Xinjiang. China instituted a 5-year ban on Columbia TriStar Pictures after it released the movie 7 Years in Tibet, starring Brad Pitt, because of the movie's portrayal of government suppression. After Taiwan opened a representative office in Vilnius in 2021, Lithuania saw a 91% drop in exports to China. China seeks deference by routinely warning countries about what it can do to them. The remarks in New Zealand in 2022 by the Chinese ambassador are typical, when he said, quote, as an economic relationship in which China buys nearly a third of a country's exports should not be taken for granted, close quote. Dealing with China's weaponization of trade is a critical prerequisite for the success of the Biden administration's strategic competition with China. The willingness of countries like Japan and Korea to stand up or to sign up to supply chain coalitions or to support Taiwan's defense depends on how fearful they are of Chinese economic retaliation, because no country can truly decouple from one of the largest economies in the world. The United States, I believe the United States and like-minded partners like Korea and Japan need to consider a new, what I call collective resilience strategy to deter China's economic coercion. So let me explain what I mean by collective resilience. Most of the targets of Chinese economic coercion, like Korea and Japan, are asymmetrically trade dependent on China, but this should not obscure the reality that many of these countries also export items to China upon which the Chinese market is highly dependent, and in some cases, almost 100% dependent. So we have been collecting data at CSIS, trade data at CSIS, that shows that shows China's trade dependencies on the countries that it has economically coerced. So, for example, Japan was a target of Chinese economic coercion with regard to the export of rare earth minerals. But at the same time, what is not known is that China is over 90% dependent on the import of silver powder from Japan. Silver powder is used for making solar panels in China. The next two suppliers of silver powder to China are the United States and South Korea. And if you put those three countries together, they make up nearly 100% of China's dependence on these countries for silver powder. China is over 80% dependent on the import of Kentucky bluegrass seed from the United States, which it uses to seed its soccer fields. The next largest exporter is Denmark. Again, you put the two together, they comprise almost 100% of China's grass seed imports. Another example, China is nearly 100% dependent on luxury goods like whiskey and brandy and lobster from countries like the UK, Japan, France, and one of the Nordic countries, and Canada. I mean, in some cases, China could certainly make up for the loss of these imports with domestic production, but not without significant cost. Indeed, the 18 countries that are previous and current targets of Chinese economic coercion. So the 18 countries that China has coerced since 2008 export over 400 items with a trade value of $46 billion, upon which the Chinese are more than 70% dependent as a proportion of its total imports of those 400 items. And these targets also have nearly 100 items valued at over $12 billion, upon which China is more than 90% dependent. So these are not insignificant numbers, and they produce a sort of leverage that these countries have. So what I'm saying is that these countries can band together and practice economic deterrence by promising collective retaliation in the trade space on some of these high dependence goods should China act against any one member of the collective. Forcing China to find a new supplier or pay a higher price for one item is, of course, not enough to change Chinese behavior. Thus, operating alone against China would not be smart. However, joining together, countries like the US, Korea, Japan, and others, joining together in an Article 5 type collective economic defense framework could threaten enough inconvenience for Beijing, could raise enough costs associated with the idea of using economic coercion that it might deter further predatory behavior by China. The Biden administration's efforts to counter Chinese economic coercion deserve merit, but they are in and of themselves incomplete. For one, the United States has encouraged countries to practice trade diversification, meaning that when China imposes tariffs or an import embargo on a target state's goods, the target state finds alternative export markets for those same goods. So for example, when China slapped tariffs on Australian barley, wine, and beef, Australia redirected these goods to other parts of the world. The United States has also developed with like-minded partners like Korea and Japan networks of reshoring and friendshoring, moving key elements of the production chain out of China or places where China exercises a lot of influence. And then the supply chain is moved to more trusted partners. And so I think many are already aware of this, so I won't go through examples. These measures are, there's nothing wrong with these measures. I think they're good. I think they're important. But in the end, they are ultimately reactive and defensive in nature. They protect some supply chains from disruption, but they do nothing to deter the overall practice of economic coercion. So this notion of sort of collective economic deterrence is not meant to displace, but to supplement a supply chain strategy, an impact mitigation strategy, a trade diversification strategy. My last point is that garnering the political will among countries to support a collective economic deterrence strategy is not easy. Free riding is likely. Smaller states would be worried China would target them as the weakest link, and companies might not be willing to participate. So rather than pulling together a random group of states that have been targeted by Chinese bullying, collective resilience could be advocated by G7 countries plus Australia. These like-minded partners would be incentivized to counter Chinese economic coercion because first, they identify their own interests with preserving the liberal international order against Chinese coercion. Second, they are all medium to large players that cannot easily be picked off by China. Third, they all participate in some sort of anti-coercion efforts, either in the European Union or have already stood up to Chinese economic bullying, as Australia has done. And fourth, they have the capabilities to leverage China's vulnerability. G7 plus Australian countries have almost 400 items upon which China is 70% dependent, with a trade value of over $37 billion. That's 2022 numbers. And almost 160 items valued at $7.5 billion upon which China is 90% dependent. So these like-minded countries could use the threat of multilateral action in the trade space to impose significant and unacceptable costs on China if China tries to coerce anyone economically. Collective resilience focuses not on the use of economic punishment, so it's not advocating a trade war. Rather, it is the credible threat by a collective of states to carry out the punishment in unison if and when China acts against any one of those states. Now, I know this is very provocative and very controversial, and there are many who would see this idea as anathema to the very liberal order that they're trying to protect. But this has to be treated as a pure competition strategy that's necessary to save the liberal international order. Hopefully, the threat of collective resilience would never have to be exercised. In that sense, it is like deterrence in the security realm. It requires both the capabilities and the political will of all involved to signal to China that it can no longer use economic coercion as a tool of diplomacy that threatens the liberal international order. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the other presentations and then to the discussion.